The unseen tenant. It began with a flicker in the corner of my eye, a shadow that wasn't there when I turned. The old house groaned under the weight of its years, its wooden bones settling into the night. I'd always thought the place was just quirky pipes that hummed floors that sighed. But that night, as I stood in the hallway, the air felt wrong, like someone had exhaled just behind me. I spun around, heart hammering, but the house was empty. Or so I thought. The mirror in the living room reflected something impossible. I'd walked past it 100 times, but this time, it caught a glimpse of movement, a silhouette darting behind me. I froze, staring at my own pale face, the reflection unblinking. Was it a trick of the light, or had the house been hiding something all along? I laughed it off, but my hands trembled as I locked the front door. Then came the smell. Faint at first, like stale bread or forgotten laundry had lingered in the kitchen. I checked the trash, the fridge, even the drains, nothing. Yet every evening it returned stronger, almost human. I started to wonder if the house was breathing, watching, waiting. The thought was absurd, but it clung to me like damp cloth. Sleep became a battle. I'd lie in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening to the house settle. But the sounds weren't right, too deliberate, too heavy for rodents or wind. One night, I heard it clearly, a single slow step above my head. My pulse roared in my ears as I grabbed my phone flashlight, shaking in my hand, and crept toward the hallway. I wasn't alone. That realization hit me as I stared at the attic access panel, its edges outlined by a faint, unnatural glow. I live alone in a pretty quiet neighborhood, so I figured that I was just being forgetful. A protein bar vanished from the counter. A sock disappeared from the laundry. Small things, easily dismissed. And then my TV would be on a different input than I left it. I'd blamed my tired mind. But now, standing beneath that panel, I knew better. The attic access was a simple square in the ceiling, its paint chipped from years of neglect. I'd never gone up there, too dusty, too creepy. But the glow, faint as it was, pulsed like a heartbeat. I dragged a chair from the kitchen, my legs unsteady, and climbed up. The panel was loose, not screwed shut as I'd assumed. Pushing it open felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. Dust rained down, catching in my throat, and I peered into the darkness. The air was thick, warm, wrong. I flicked on my flashlight, and my breath caught. A narrow ladder led upward, its rungs worn smooth. Someone had been using it. I should have called for help right then. But curiosity, or stupidity, pulled me forward. I climbed each step, creaking under my weight, the flashlight beam slicing through the gloom. The attic was larger than I'd imagined, a maze of beams and shadows. My light caught something in the corner, a sleeping bag, some snacks, a small camping stove, empty water bottles. My stomach twisted. Someone had clearly been living up there. Not an animal, not a ghost, a person. But where were they now? The thought sent a chill down my spine as I scanned the attic. The sleeping bag was rumpled as if someone had just left it. A half-eaten granola bar lay beside a crumpled water bottle. They could be watching me, hidden in the dark. I swung the flashlight, wildly heart-pounding, but the shadows held their secrets. I backed toward the ladder, every nerve screaming to run. Back in the hallway, I slammed the panel shut and dragged the chair away. My hands shook as I dialed the authorities. My voice barely steady as I explained what I'd found. I called the cops, immediately locked myself in my room, with a bat freaking out, while they did a full sweep. They arrived quickly, their flashlights cutting through the night as they searched the house. They found no one at first, but when they checked the attic, there was a little setup up there. The officers confirmed my discovery. Someone had turned my attic into a hidden camp. The truth unraveled slowly. The intruder was a stranger to me, but but known to the neighborhood, a young man who'd fallen through the cracks. The person was my neighbor's grown son, who apparently had some drug issues and got kicked out a while back. He'd been squatting in my house for months, slipping through the attic while I slept. He broke in when I was on vacation a few months earlier and just never left. He'd scavenged my food, used my TV, lived a parallel life just above my own. The aftermath was a blur of police reports and sleepless nights. I couldn't stay in that house, not after knowing someone had been there, watching, waiting. I moved out 3 weeks later, but the memory of that attic lingered a stain on my sense of safety. I started noticing things I'd ignored before, the way the house seemed to hold its breath when I entered, the faint scratches on the attic panel I'd never questioned. Had he been there the whole time, listening to my every move? I began researching the house's history, digging into old records and neighbor gossip. The previous owners had left abruptly, citing personal reasons. One neighbor, an older woman with sharp eyes, hinted at strange noises long before I moved in. She said the house had always felt occupied, even when it stood empty. I didn't press her, but her words stuck with me. What if he wasn't the first to hide in those walls? Every night I relived that moment of discovery. The ladder, the glow, the sleeping bag, they haunted my dreams. I installed cameras in my new apartment, checked the locks obsessively. But the fear wasn't just about him. What if the house itself had invited him in, drawn him to its shadows? The thought was irrational, but it gnawed at me. Old houses have memories, and mine had kept a secret far too long. I tried to move on, to rebuild my sense of normalcy. But the smallest things, a misplaced key, a flicker of light, sent my heart racing. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound of footsteps. The man was gone, locked away, but the house had left its mark. I still have trouble sleeping in total silence because now every sound makes me think someone's crawling around above me. That fear, that violation, was something I couldn't outrun. Now I live in a new place, far from that old house. But I keep the lights on at night, just in case. The world feels less certain, the shadows less empty. I tell myself it's over, that I'm safe. But deep down I know I'll always wonder what else might be hiding just out of sight. The cursed road. The forest swallowed the last traces of daylight, leaving only the hum of our engine and the faint glow of headlights. The grassy road followed a gentle left curve for about 100 yards, and then opened up to a small roundabout with a flat campground looking area to the right of it. We were 5 friends, barely past our college years, chasing the thrill of the Pacific Northwest wilderness. Our backpacks were heavy with gear, our hearts light with the promise of escape, but the air carried a chill that wasn't just the evening cold. It was something older, watchful. The trees stood like sentinels, their gnarled branches weaving a canopy that blocked the stars. The site looked like it had been used plenty of times, but there was a lot of untouched grass on the road and a flat area, so we assumed no one had been there in a while. We were wrong. As we rounded the bend, a flash of red pierced the darkness. Our headlights caught the taillights of a parked car, glowing like embers in the night. It sat there silent, a stranger in our perfect plan. Our breath caught the excitement draining from our faces. Our hearts collectively dropped as we slowed to a stop and decided what to do. The car was alone, but a tent nearby sagged under the weight of damp canvas. Was someone inside? The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for our next move. Jake, the reckless one, pointed to a faint trail snaking into the woods. "Let's see what's out there," he said, his voice tight. We nodded, too stubborn to turn back. The trail was a narrow scar through the undergrowth, barely visible under our flashlights. We hiked up it for a 4 mile or so and really liked the way it looked. It felt like the wilderness we dreamed of, raw, untouched, free from the buzz of cell phones. But the deeper we went, the more the forest changed. The air grew heavy, the shadows sharper, as if the trees themselves were leaning in to listen. We laughed it off, called it nerves, but the unease was real. We should have listened to it. After deciding this would be our spot for the upcoming weekend, we packed up and headed home. The drive back was silent, the image of that car lingering like a splinter in our minds. Back in town, we checked maps, confirmed the land was public, and packed our gear with renewed determination. This was our adventure, and no random car would steal it. But the forest had other plans. We returned under a moonless sky, our car, crunching along the same grassy road. We saw the reflection of our headlights glaring back at us from the darkness like the eyes of a large demon, angry that we'd intruded on its slumber. The car was still there, the tent unchanged. We could hear a dog barking and saw a tent set up near the car, so we decided to turn and head home in defeat. The dog's cries echoed sharp and frantic as we retreated. At home, we debated convincing ourselves one more try might work. Maybe they'd be gone by tomorrow. The next night was no different. We pulled up, and the car was still there, along with the tent and the barking dog. The dog's voice was raw now, a plea more than a threat. We parked on the roundabout about 50 feet away from the car and tent and hiked up the trail so we could be away from whoever was already there. The trail was darker than before, our flashlights barely cutting through the gloom. Every rustle made us jump, every shadow a potential confrontation. What if the camper was watching? We set up camp in silence, the dog's distant cries a grim soundtrack. The night was restless, our laughter forced. We joked about what the camper or campers we passed must be thinking or doing right now, and tried to scare each other with half-cocked theories about whoever it was and what they might do to take revenge on us for barging in their quiet evening. But the forest was too still, the air too thick. We drank to drown the tension, told stories to fill the silence, but sleep came hard. Morning brought no comfort. The woods felt empty, as if something vital had been drained away. The next day passed in a haze of hikes and half-hearted exploration. The trail seemed to twist in ways it hadn't before, landmarks shifting like mirages. We blamed the alcohol, the lack of sleep, but the forest was different now. By evening, we were done, ready to flee the oppressive quiet. Everyone was tired, hungover, and pretty much ready to go back to civilization. So we started hiking back to the car. The campsite was a frozen tableau. I can only describe the scene as eerie. It felt like all the life had been sucked out of the wilderness. Not a bird, not a breeze, nothing. The car was still there, and so was the tent, but we didn't hear the dog barking anymore. The tent flap hung open, swaying in a wind that wasn't there. The car was up on the type of little ramps people use for working on their vehicles. A cluttered table stood nearby, motor oil tools, a milk jug with the lid off, food scattered like an abandoned meal. It was wrong, all of it. We should have run. But curiosity won. Walking cautiously through the campsite, we looked for any clues about why the person or people could have left in such a hurry. Every step felt like a violation, the silence pressing against us. One of my friends pointed out that the windows of the vehicle were heavily fogged up, so we tried our best to peer inside. The tinted glass hid most of it, but at the edges a shape emerged. This made it possible to just barely see the silhouette of a large dog in the back seat. The dog was still, its eyes, dull breaths, shallow. It sat there upright and panting hard, but not moving or making any other noise. My chest tightened. It was Sunday morning, and for all I knew, that dog had been trapped in this car since Thursday night when we first arrived. How long had it been alone, starving? We debated breaking the window, but fear stopped us. What if it was dangerous? We decided with heavy hearts that the best choice would be to drive back to town and call animal control as soon as we had service. The drive back was a blur, guilt and fear warring inside us. We called animal control, our voices unsteady, begging for haste. The officer promised to check, but hours later there was no update. I called again, desperate. He said he tried to follow my instructions, but to my dismay, he mistakenly continued straight down the gravel road for several miles rather than turning right onto the grassy road. He'd try again tomorrow. I hung up, the dog's hollow eyes haunting me. Should we have done more? Sleep was impossible. The forest clung to us, its silence louder than any scream. That's when one of my friends, who had been silently browsing her phone for a while, suddenly gasped. Her voice shook as she read. And it was a news story from a city about 4 hours away from ours. A woman dead in her car, found with her dog. On Redacted Road, the same one we went down to camp in the town of Redacted. The words hit like a punch, each detail matching our nightmare. We sat frozen, the truth sinking in. When they arrived on the scene, they tried the door of the vehicle, which was locked. A patrol officer had seen her through the window. Upon shining his flashlight through the tinted window of the vehicle, the state patrol officer was able to identify the body of a woman in the back seat, accompanied by the dog in question. My phone rang a private number. I answered, and a female voice said, "Hello, this is Detective Redacted." "Is this Mr. Redacted?" I swallowed hard, confirming. She asked if I was the person who called in the dog trapped in the car. I told her everything, careful to skip the news. She seemed surprised and said, "Oh, that's it." Her voice was clipped professional. And I then asked if she needed anything else from me, and she said no, but that I would hear from her if anything else came up. I asked about the dog, and she said it was safe. But something in her tone felt off. We were reeling. We all started talking at once, asking each other if anyone had touched the vehicle or anything at the campsite. Thank God we hadn't. The what-ifs were endless. What if we'd opened the door? Apparently, it had been trapped in that vehicle so long that it started eating the person who was in there with it. The image was a knife in my gut, twisting. Later, we learned more. The woman was transient, a mother with an ex-husband and a 9-year-old son. She'd been running, maybe from her demons, maybe from something worse. She died from a drug overdose. But the road was the real enigma, according to several other news stories that came up in my search results, stretching back to at least as early as teen years before our event took place, and up until the current year of 2025. There had been a surprising number of mysterious deaths that occur on that specific road that we found. The road was a graveyard marked by stories no one could explain. Hikers found cold campers vanished. Drifters met grim ends. Some whispered of a curse, a wound in the land that drew the lost. Others called it chance, a cruel string of coincidences. We didn't need answers, we just wanted out. We haven't been back to that neck of the woods since, and probably never will. The forest hasn't let us go. I see that dog's eyes in my dreams, staring through the fogged glass, pleading. Every creak in my house, every shadow that lingers, pulls me back to that road. We thought we were chasing freedom, but we stumbled into something else, something that clings to us heavy as the silence of that cursed wilderness. The phantom at the threshold. The night was a shroud, thick with mist, that clung to the rural edges of the UK village like a restless spirit. In a modest house, a family of 5 slept unaware of the terror creeping closer. The silence shattered with a violent thud against the front door, a sound that clawed its way into their dreams. Sarah, the mother, jolted awake, her heart hammering as the banging grew louder, more desperate. It wasn't a knock, it was an assault. Each strike shaking the walls, promising violence, and then a voice slurred and unhinged slithered through the night, calling for a woman who didn't exist in their home. This night, I was woken up very abruptly by a harsh banging on the front door. The sound wasn't human. It was primal, like a beast demanding entry. Sarah clutched the bedsheets, her husband Tom, already halfway out of bed. Their 3 children, Lily, Max, and little Emma, stirred in their rooms, oblivious to the danger. At first, I thought that it was just someone drunk thinking it was their house, but then they started trying to turn the handle. The doorknob rattled violently, metal grinding against metal. Sarah's breath caught. Every night, I always check the door is locked, and sometimes even the chain put across as well. Tonight, that habit might have saved them. Tom crept toward the stairs, his silhouette tense in the dim glow of the hallway light. Sarah followed her phone, trembling in her hand. The emergency number half dialed. My husband wasn't near the door, and I stood on the stairs with my phone, in case I needed to call someone. The banging stopped for a moment, replaced by a low, guttural muttering. The man started rambling and slightly slurring his speech. It wasn't extreme slurring, but his voice wasn't quite right. It was wrong, too deep, too jagged, like a voice scraped from the bottom of a nightmare. It seemed clear that he was either on something or mentally unwell. He called out again, his words slicing through the quiet. "Where is she? I know she's here." He kept asking for a certain woman by name, and my husband told him that there was no one by that name here and to go away. Tom's voice was steady, but Sarah heard the edge in it, the fear he was trying to bury. And the man kept insisting that we were hiding her and said he was coming in. The door groaned under a new onslaught, wood splintering faintly. During this time, there were a lot of strange sounds coming from behind the door. Thumping, scratching, and another sound that I couldn't quite place. It was almost animalistic, a scraping that made Sarah's skin crawl, as if claws, not hands, were raking the wood. Sarah's thumb hovered over the call button. My husband then told him that I had called the police. The lie worked for a moment. He gave a few more frantic thumps, and then I assumed left because we heard nothing else. Silence fell heavy and suffocating. Tom pressed his ear to the door, listening for footsteps. But there was nothing. We didn't hear anything like him attempting this with the neighbors either. Sarah's legs shook as she sank onto the stairs, her eyes locked on the door, and for a few hours I waited in case he came back. She gripped a tennis racket from the closet, its weight a small comfort. I had a tennis racket that I would have used if I had to, and luckily it didn't come to that. Morning came gray and cold, the mist still lingering like a curse. Sarah stepped outside, her stomach twisting. In the morning, since it was a weekend, I decided to go check outside, and honestly, I felt a little ill. The front door was a battlefield. There was a massive dent in the door, which I thought surely couldn't have been caused by a fist alone. Deep yod marred the wood, splintered and raw. Then on the door and the panels near it were fingernail marks and blood. Streaks of crimson smeared the panels too much to be a simple cut. It was enough that it needed to be washed off. Near the bins, chaos reigned. Between the door and where the bins are, there was a smashed ashtray, also with blood on it, and lots of pieces. Shards glittered in the dirt-stained red. One of the outdoor plants had been tipped over with the plant and soil all over the ground. Sarah's knees buckled. My best guess is he tried to smash the door with the ashtray and cut himself, but that's just speculation. The evidence painted a picture of rage, unhinged, unstoppable, and my blood ran cold, thinking about how clearly aggressive this man was. Sarah's mind raced, and we have absolutely no reason to be targeted. They were ordinary, their lives quiet. Why them, she called Tom, and they inspected the damage together. Their children still asleep, unaware of the night's horror. The dent was too deep, the blood too real. This wasn't a drunken mistake, it was something darker. They visited their neighbor, Mrs. Harrow, a widow who'd lived in the village for decades. We told our neighbors, who were absolutely horrified, and they said they thought they heard something, but just assumed it was a drunk. When Sarah mentioned the woman's name, Mrs. Harrow's face paled. When we mentioned the woman's name, the neighbor says, "Oh God, that's..." and said her name. Her voice dropped to a whisper. She used to live where you do a few doors down. She used to be into drugs and had a few shady people around, and the neighbor reckons maybe one of her old druggist companions was searching for her. The woman Eliza had left years ago, her house now a magnet for trouble. And even now there have been a few incidents at her house where the police have been called. But I'm not sure what for. Sarah's stomach churned. Eliza's past had reached out, clawing at their door. The man wasn't just lost, he was hunting. What if he wasn't human? The thought crept in unbidden. The sounds, the strength, the blood, it didn't add up. What if Eliza's debts weren't just to dealers, but to something else? Sarah pushed the thought away, but it lingered cold and sharp. They didn't take chances after that. Now we have a video doorbell and alarms fitted. So at least a button now goes straight to a security system that if you don't answer, will send the authorities. The system was a lifeline, a shield against the unknown. It didn't end in danger, but it so easily could have. The what-ifs haunted Sarah, her children's faces, the door giving way. The man's hands around her throat. And that's what's scary as hell. She checked the locks obsessively, now her eyes darting to the shadows. So seriously, she doesn't live here. And to the phantom at their threshold, please never come again. But the village held secrets. Mrs. Harrow mentioned old stories, tales of a figure seen at night, always searching, always angry. The locals called it the Seeker, a shadow tied to debts unpaid, human or otherwise. Sarah didn't believe in ghosts, but the dent in her door wasn't a lie. What if the man wasn't a man at all, but something summoned by Eliza's sins? The thought followed her, a whisper in the dark. Weeks passed, but the fear didn't. One night, the video doorbell chimed, its screen flickering. Sarah's heart stopped. The camera showed nothing, just mist curling like fingers across the lens. But the audio picked up a sound, a low, slurred voice calling Eliza's name. She froze the tennis racket back in her hand as the voice grew closer, then faded into the night. Tom checked the footage, but the mist was too thick. The figure, if it was there, gone. The Seeker hadn't forgotten. Sarah never told the children. She smiled, kissed their foreheads, and locked the doors. But every night she listened for the thump, the scratch, the voice. And in the village, the mist never seemed to lift. The silent watcher, in the dead of night, when the world holds its breath, you feel it, a weight like unseen eyes boring into your soul. Out in the country where stars drown in the vastness of the sky, I lived alone with my dog, a speck of life in a sea of silence. One night I woke up in the middle of the night to the motion sensor light going off outside. It wasn't the first time. The wind or a stray fox could trigger it. But this felt different. The air was too still, the silence too heavy. I crept to the window, heart thudding, and peered into the glow. At first I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something. But then I saw it, a shape that didn't belong. The human mind tricks itself, conjuring monsters from shadows. But when I looked out the window, I saw a man standing at the end of my driveway. He wasn't pacing, wasn't shifting, just rooted like a statue carved from the night itself. His face was hidden in the dim light, but I felt his gaze unyielding, locked on my home. I froze. I just stood there, staring at him, and he didn't move at all. My dog, usually restless, lay silent at my feet, ears flat. The light flickered, casting jagged shadows across the gravel. Was he real? I blinked, expecting him to vanish, but he remained an anchor in the dark. The lights went off after a while, and everything went back to dark and quiet. Sleep becomes a stranger when fear takes root. I didn't sleep much after that. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves felt like a signal. I kept the blinds half open, unable to resist checking the driveway. The night stretched on endless, and I wondered if I'd imagined him. But the memory of his stillness clung to me, sharp as a blade. What did he want? The next night it happened again. The light came on, and there he was. Same spot, same eerie calm, as if he'd never left. My phone trembled in my hand as I dialed the sheriff, voice barely a whisper. Same spot, same stillness, just standing there, staring at my home. Words meant to comfort can feel like lies. I called the sheriff's department, and they sent someone to check it out. The deputy's flashlight swept the empty driveway, finding nothing but tire tracks and dust. By the time they got there, this guy was already gone. He told me it was probably a vagrant someone lost in the night. The deputy told me that it was probably just some drunk guy or someone passing through, and that I shouldn't worry unless he started coming closer. But his words dissolved in the chill of my fear. I locked every door, checked every window, and still felt exposed. If he was gone, why did I feel watched? But that didn't make me feel any better. Some terrors don't need to move to haunt you. This went on for about a week. Every night the light snapped on, and there he was, a silent sentinel at the edge of my world. I stopped calling the sheriff. Their patrols found nothing. Every night, like clockwork, I'd wake up and see him standing there at the end of the driveway. I began to dread the dark, my sanctuary now a cage. My dog refused to leave my side. His warmth, my only anchor. He never moved, never said anything, just stood there, staring at my house. But his presence grew heavier, as if the air itself carried his intent. I started closing the blinds at night, but I still felt like I could feel him out there. The days blurred into a haze of exhaustion and unease. I tried to reclaim my routine, feeding my dog, brewing coffee, tending the garden, but the nights loomed like a storm on the horizon. It got to the point where I started closing the blinds at night, but I still felt like I could feel him out there. I'd sit in the living room, lights dim, straining to hear any sound beyond the usual chorus of crickets and wind. My dog, once eager to roam the yard, now clung to me, his eyes darting to the windows. I began to notice small things. A branch snapped too neatly, a patch of grass flattened near the fence. Was he circling closer? I installed a second motion sensor. Its beam trained on the driveway's edge, but it never caught more than that single, unchanging figure. I started researching, scouring online forums for stories like mine. Some spoke of trespassers, others of specters tied to forgotten tragedies. The land around my home was old, its history buried in deeds and whispers. I found a record of a family who'd lived here decades ago, their farm lost to a fire. No deaths were recorded, but the details were sparse. Could he be tied to this place? I drove to the county library, digging through dusty archives. A faded photo showed a man in work boots standing by a fence that looked eerily like mine. His face was blurred, but the posture, rigid, unyielding, felt familiar. I began to speak to him in my mind, a desperate attempt to understand. Who are you? What do you want? The silence answered, heavy and unbroken. I considered leaving, packing a bag, and driving to the city. But this was my home, my refuge. I couldn't let fear drive me out. Instead, I bought a security camera, its lens trained on the driveway. The first night it recorded nothing but static. The second, a faint outline appeared too vague to identify. Was he toying with me? I stopped sleeping entirely, my world shrinking to the glow of the motion sensor and the dread of his return. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. And then, just like that, it stopped. I never saw him again after that week. The motion sensor stayed dark, the driveway empty. I waited, braced for his return, but the nights remained quiet. With no explanation, no reason, it just ended. I checked the camera footage, finding only blank frames. The flattened grass was gone, the snapped branches untouched. It was as if he'd never been there. My dog began to relax, his tail wagging again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered, a residue of his presence woven into the air. I tried to move on, to reclaim the peace I'd once cherished. I tore out the old fence, hoping to erase any connection to the past. I planted new flowers, their colors a defiance against the dark. But at night, I still hesitated before opening the blinds, half expecting to see him standing there. I never told anyone, not friends, not family. I've never told anyone about this before. The weight of it lived in me, a secret too heavy to carry alone. It's probably not that big a deal, but it's something that's obviously stuck with me. Months later, I found a journal in the attic, its pages brittle and yellowed. It belonged to a woman who'd lived here long ago. Her words filled with fear of a man who watched her home night after night, never speaking. The entries stopped abruptly, with no resolution. I burned the journal, scattering its ashes in the wind. Some stories don't need to be kept. But even now, when the motion sensor flickers, my heart skips, and I wonder if he's truly gone, or if he's waiting just beyond the light. The neighbor's warning. The apartment hallway always felt too narrow, like the walls were closing in. I'd rush past the neighbor's door, my sneakers squeaking on the faded linoleum, heart racing for no reason I could name. His door chipped, and gray seemed to watch me, the peephole glinting like an unblinking eye. I told myself it was just a door, just a man, but something about him made my skin crawl. Every time I passed, I held my breath, praying he wouldn't step out. His voice carried through the thin walls. Low, gravelly, it seeped into our apartment at odd hours. Muttering, laughing, sometimes arguing with no one. I'd lie in bed, clutching my blanket, trying to make sense of the words. Was he talking to me, or was the building itself whispering his secrets? The sounds were never clear, but they left a weight in my chest, a dread I couldn't shake. Then I saw his shadow. It was late, the hallway lit only by a flickering bulb. I was taking out the trash when I caught it, a long, jagged shape stretching across the floor, moving too slowly to be natural. I froze, garbage bag slipping from my hand, as the shadow paused, then vanished. I ran back inside, heart pounding, convincing myself it was a trick of the light. But I started noticing things after that. A faint scratch on our door frame, a cigarette butt outside our welcome mat. The air in the building changed. It felt heavier, like the walls were holding their breath. I'd catch myself staring at his door from our living room window, waiting for it to open. What was he doing in there, behind that gray slab of wood? My mom tried to reassure me, saying he was just eccentric, but her eyes betrayed her. She felt it too. The unease, the sense that we were being watched. I wasn't imagining it. That realization hit me one evening when Mom came back from talking to him. My mom and this neighbor were having a casual conversation. She'd hoped to smooth things over to find some way to coexist, but evidently, something went wrong during the conversation, because my mom suddenly came into our apartment, loudly closing the door and locking it. Her face was pale, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the deadbolt. She was visibly upset and shaken. I asked what happened, the voice small. Her voice was trembling, and she said the neighbor had said this completely unprompted. "You know, if I were you, I'd keep your daughter away from guys like me." The words hung in the air, sharp and cold. I didn't understand what he meant, not fully. But my mind filled in the gaps with horrors I couldn't name. Was he watching me when I walked to the mailbox? Did he know I was alone most days? My stomach twisted, and I sank onto the couch, staring at the locked door. And the worst part was that I was often home alone, since I did online school when my mom was at work. The apartment, once my safe haven, felt like a trap. I'd sit at my desk, headphones on, trying to focus on math or history, but every sound, the hum of the fridge, the creak of the floor, made me jump. What if he was outside right now? Testing the knob, waiting for me to slip up, I started checking the locks obsessively, sometimes 5 or 6 times before I could relax. Mom tried to protect me. My mom only told me what he said because she wanted to warn me to stay away from him and to never ever leave the door unlocked. She bought an extra deadbolt, taught me how to wedge a chair under the knob. But it wasn't enough. The fear was alive, growing, feeding on every shadow, every noise. I stopped going to the mailbox alone. I kept the curtains drawn even during the day, terrified of catching his gaze through the window. The neighbor's presence became a shadow over our lives. He had a pretty blatant feeling of disdain towards us, I guess. His glares in the hallway, his muttered comments as we passed, made it clear we weren't welcome in his world. I started piecing together stories from other tenants, whispers about his past, his temper, the way he'd linger in the stairwell at odd hours. Had he always been this way, or had something in the building turned him sour? The more I learned, the less I wanted to know. I tried to distract myself with schoolwork, with music, with anything to keep my mind off him. But the fear was relentless. From that point on, I never felt safe being home alone. I'd imagine him forcing his way in his heavy footsteps, echoing through the apartment. What did he mean by guys like me? Was it a warning, a threat, or something worse? My dreams were haunted by his voice, his shadow, his door swinging open in the dark. Mom and I stopped talking about him, but the tension never left. We moved through our days like actors in a play, pretending everything was fine. But the apartment wasn't ours anymore. It belonged to the fear he'd planted. I started noticing small things, a faint smudge on the window, a strange mark on the hallway wall. Were they his? Or was my mind inventing evidence I couldn't tell anymore? Then, one day, he was gone. Thankfully, he ended up dying before he ever followed through on his creepy comment. The news came quietly, a murmur among the neighbors. No one knew exactly what happened, and I didn't ask. Relief washed over me, but it was tainted and incomplete. I felt guilty for feeling glad for celebrating the end of a life, but I couldn't help it. The threat was gone, or so I thought. Why? Even after he was gone, the apartment didn't feel right. The hallway still seemed to watch me. The walls still whispered. We moved out soon after to a new place with brighter lights and friendlier faces. But the memory of his words stayed with me, a scar I couldn't see, but always felt. What had he meant, and what might have happened if he'd lived? I tried to bury the question to move on, but it surfaced in quiet moments in the pause before I locked the door. Now in my new home, I'm safer, stronger. But I still check the locks at night, still glance over my shoulder in empty hallways. The world feels fragile, like it could crack open to reveal something dark. His voice, his warning lives in the back of my mind, a reminder that safety is never guaranteed. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I wonder if he's really gone, or if some part of him lingers just beyond the door. The intruder at midnight. The hotel room was a sanctuary, a slice of calm after a night of vibrant Mexican streets. We got inside our room. We're setting things down and all that. My wife Clara hummed softly, her earrings glinting as she unpacked her purse. The air was warm, the hum of the AC a steady drone. But something felt off, a prickle at the back of my neck. We'd just returned from dinner, our laughter still echoing from the restaurant. Then a soft knock broke the quiet, sharp and deliberate. The sound was wrong. Too quiet, too careful. A man quietly says something in Spanish, in an inflection that's clearly trying to get our attention. It was like room service, but we hadn't ordered anything. My wife looks at me, wondering who would be at the door. Clara's eyes widened, her hand pausing on her bag. And at this point, I should clarify that we had the "Do Not Disturb" tag on the door. Who ignores that? The knock came again, more insistent. My pulse quickened, a warning I couldn't shake. Clara gestured for me to check. My wife signals for me to go to the door, so I go over. I moved silently, my bare feet cold on the tile. At this point, we've made no sounds for probably a minute before and during the knocks. The room was still, our breaths held. And just as I reach the door, the keycard unlocks it, and it opens. The door swung inward, and a man stood there, inches from my face. His clothes stained, his eyes wide with surprise. My heart slammed against my ribs. I reacted on instinct. I put my hand on the door to prevent it from opening any further, and I think he was as surprised as I was. He stammered, his voice a jumble of Spanish. He starts speaking in Spanish, and I hear the word Wi-Fi somewhere in there, and I say, "No, español." "Wi-Fi down?" he asked in broken English, his hands twitching. My wife says it's not. Clara's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension. I kept my grip on the door, my mind racing. This wasn't right. He had a master key. He lingered, his eyes darting past me into the room. I'm just kind of shell-shocked by what just happened, and I keep my hand on the door as he talks, and eventually leaves. Finally, he backed away, muttering, and vanished down the hall. I shut the door and engaged the physical lock this time. My hands shook as I slid the bolt into place. I usually do this, but we had just walked in and were setting our stuff down. Clara and I stared at each other, the weight of what happened sinking in. This wasn't room service. This was a burglary attempt. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in. I talked with my wife as we tried to gather our thoughts about what had just happened. We pieced it together in hushed tones. Essentially, a man knocked, got no reply, and then let himself in. And asked about our Wi-Fi. He thought we were out, his keycard proof of his intent. No, this was a clear burglary attempt. He had a master keycard and thought that we weren't home. The Wi-Fi excuse was flimsy, a cover for his shock at finding us there. My stomach churned at the thought of his hands on our belongings. We sat on the bed, adrenaline still coursing. What if we'd been out longer? Our passports cash. Clara's jewelry all left vulnerable. What if we'd been asleep, the AC drowning out his knocks? The scenarios played like a horror reel. A minute or two after this went down. Once we collected ourselves and understood what just occurred, I passed the information to the front desk in case this guy attempts other doors. The clerk's face tightened, promising to alert security. They seemed to take it pretty seriously, but there were no updates beyond that. I wanted more cameras checked, locks changed, but their assurances felt hollow. The night stretched on sleep impossible. The fact that this just happened has my mind kind of blown, and I don't know if I fully processed it yet. Every creak in the hall made us flinch. Like, what if we were back 30 minutes later? Probably would have lost some stuff. Or walked in on him rifling through our bags. 5 minutes later, we walk in on a guy in our hotel room. The thought was a cold spike. What if we'd gone to bed earlier tonight? We could have been asleep. The AC's roar would have masked everything. The AC is loud, and I don't know if I would have heard the knocking through my sleep. Clara clutched my arm, her voice barely a whisper. What if he comes back? The question hung heavy unanswered. If it was going to go down, surely the way it did was optimal. But those ifs are crazy. We were lucky, but luck wasn't enough. I'll definitely be storing our valuables in the safe now. The safe's lock clicked shut as we stashed our essentials. Should have done that already, but we just recently got here. Rookie mistake. Lesson learned, I guess. In the future, stuff is going immediately into the safe, and the lock is getting engaged right away. The hotel's charm was tainted. Its vibrant colors dulled by suspicion. Every stranger in the hall was a threat. every sound a potential keycard. We stayed awake, plotting our next steps, checking out early demanding answers from management. Mexico was still beautiful, but this moment had cracked its surface. The man's face lingered in my mind, his surprise a mirror of my own. He'd try again somewhere someone else's room, and we, shaken but unharmed, would carry this lesson forward, a scar from a night that could have been so much worse. The girl who saw shadows. The house was a fortress of quiet, its walls holding the warmth of a sleeping family. But the night outside was alive with menace. A sudden jolt ripped through the silence, a heavy thud against the back door, like a warning carved in sound. James, wide awake, felt his pulse spike as the noise multiplied, a cascade of bumps slithering along the side of the house. The dog's frantic barks tore through the air, a primal alarm that something was wrong, terribly wrong. Then came the pounding, a desperate rhythm at the front door, and a voice, high-panicked female, screaming words that turned James's blood to ice. All of a sudden, I heard a loud thud at the back door. It wasn't a knock, it was a collision, as if something heavy had been thrown against the wood. Then I heard a bunch of bumps all along the walkway on the side of the house. The sounds were erratic, like footsteps stumbling, scraping, searching. And meanwhile, the dog was losing his mind. Their golden retriever, Rusty, snarled and scratched at the door, his hackles raised. There was pounding at the front door. The noise was relentless, a drumbeat of urgency. I thought it might be the cops or some kind of emergency. James threw off the covers, his wife Clara stirring groggily beside him. So I jumped out of bed and turned to the corner to the front door, only to see a girl, probably in her 20s. Very small, yelling, "Let me in! Let me in! 4 men in a van! They're hunting me!" Her face was pressed against the glass, pale and streaked with dirt, her eyes wide with terror. And I'm just responding, "What the F is going on for time?" As she's pounding on the front door, James peered past her into the dark street, empty, silent. No van, no men. I looked around and didn't see anyone. I told her as much, but then my wife rounded the corner and said to let her in. Clara's voice was firm, maternal. The door swung open, and the girl stumbled inside, her bare feet, leaving muddy prints on the hardwood. The girl ran in with no shoes on, wearing muddied pajama pants. She was tiny, barely 5 feet, her hair tangled and damp. I told her to sit down and said that I'd check things out. James grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch, scanning the yard. Nothing. No van. No footsteps, just the cold night air. He locked the door behind him and turned back to the girl who was trembling on the couch. As I was putting on pants, she starts yelling, "They're right here! 4 men! They want to murder me! There's one aiming at me! They want to kill me!" Her voice cracked, her eyes darting to the windows. James frowned. There was no one outside, but there was no one. The girl's panic was infectious, though, and Clara knelt beside her, trying to calm her. She started running around our house, jumped on our bed, and slammed our window shut, and then ran into the guest room, then the bathtub, and then the laundry room. Her movements were frantic, erratic like a trapped animal. She knocked over a lamp, its crash muffled by the carpet. James's patience frayed. At that point, I was losing my patience. So I told her, "Go to the couch and sit down there. There's no one out there. If you live 2 blocks away, I'll drive you." The words slipped out before he could stop them. And that was a big mistake. The girl's eyes lit up, but not with relief, with something wilder. At that point, I realized that she was unhinged and probably experiencing some kind of neurological episode. Her fear wasn't rational. It was a storm in her mind, conjuring phantoms only she could see. James grabbed his keys, desperate to get her out. I just wanted her out of the house, so I got the car, while my wife brought her outside. Clara guided the girl to the driveway, her arm around her shaking shoulders. I checked the mirrors, totally empty streets. The neighborhood was a ghost town, streetlights casting long, lonely beams. The girl started saying that they were crawling on my car, and I assured her that they weren't, and asked for her address. Her voice was a whisper now frantic. 16th Avenue and 15th Street. She said. I told her that didn't exist in this neighborhood. The girl's story unraveled further. She screamed and said they were coming. We hadn't even left yet. James gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. I told her again no one was out there. He started the car following her vague directions 2 blocks, she'd said. I asked her for directions if it was close, and I followed the rough 2 blocks that way she mentioned earlier. But every turn led to nowhere. She started spitting out wrong addresses, and everywhere she said it should be, it wasn't. She muttered about losing them, her body twisting in the backseat, eyes scanning the empty road. And then she covered it up by saying that she was just trying to lose them, crawling around the back seat and checking out the windows. Her voice rose to a shriek. They're chasing us on scooters. I can see the gun. James slammed on the brakes. They're chasing us on scooters. I can see the gun, she yelled. The street was dead silent. No scooters, no guns, no men. And she shouted, go left, right, 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 left. And of course, no one was there. James's patience snapped. I hit the brakes and I turned her and said, sit your butt down and put on a seatbelt. She flinched, her hands fumbling, and she protested. So I said that I wasn't driving until she did. She pointed to a grand house, its windows dark. And then she pointed to a really nice house and said, that one's mine. James's gut twisted. Was she luring him somewhere? And it occurred to me maybe I was the one in danger. Maybe she was directing me somewhere to get jumped. He stopped the car. So I told her, I'm not driving you anymore. Where do you actually live? And where can I drop you off? Her eyes darted and she mumbled. And she said 7-Eleven. So that's where I went. The 7-Eleven was a block away. Its neon glow a stark contrast to the night's unease. It was just a couple of doors down from my house, and I told her to stay there and called the cops. James watched her stumble into the store, her bare feet slapping the pavement. I ran back home to see if we had any old shoes that she could take, and I assumed that she had taken some kind of weird drug. Clara was waiting, her face pale. They locked the doors, and soon 5 cop cars ended up combing the neighborhood for a while. Sirens wailed, lights flashing, but the girl was gone, swallowed by the night or taken by the police. But the story didn't end there. The next day, James found a scrap of paper in the back seat, torn, smudged with mud, with a single word scrawled in shaky handwriting. And had she dropped it? Or had it been there before? He showed it to Clara, who shivered. They checked the house, finding faint, muddy footprints leading to the attic door, a place the girl hadn't gone. Or had she? The attic was locked, but the air felt wrong, heavy, like someone had been there. A neighbor, old Mr. Grayson, stopped by later. He'd heard the commotion and shared a chilling tale. Years ago, a young woman had lived nearby, always running from shadows no one else saw. She'd vanished one night, leaving behind stories of a curse, a presence that hunted those who saw it. Was the girl running from men or from something else? James didn't believe in curses. But the paper, the footprints, the girl's wild eyes. They gnawed at him. Weeks later, the 7-Eleven clerk mentioned a strange detail. The girl had stood in the store, staring at the security camera, whispering, "They're still here." The footage showed nothing, just her alone, her reflection distorted in the glass. But James couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her into their home. At night, Rusty growled at the attic door, and Clara swore she heard whispers. Faint, urgent, calling her name. Now James checks the locks twice, but the shadows feel closer. The girl was gone, but whatever she'd brought with her lingered, watching, waiting. And in the quiet, he wondered if the real danger was still out there or already inside. The girl at the door, Chaos doesn't knock politely. It shatters the silence. My brother and I were woken up by loud banging and crying at our front door. The sound was raw, desperate, clawing through the stillness of our rundown neighborhood. We lived on a street where trouble wasn't a stranger. Broken bottles, flickering streetlights, and the occasional scream were part of the rhythm. We live in a rough neighborhood, so naturally my brother grabbed a shotgun and stormed to the door, his shadow looming large. I stumbled after him, heart pounding, half asleep, but wired with adrenaline. Was this a trick, a robbery? The crying outside grew louder, a jagged sob that didn't sound human. We were both tired as hell and freaked out. Some voices cut deeper than the dark. We'd recently had a girl from the neighborhood break into my car, so we assumed it might actually be her. I pressed my ear to the door, the wood cold against my skin. I looked through the front door's window. We've got a one-way film on it, and didn't see anyone else around. But the crying was unmistakable now. A girl, young, her words choking on panic. I crouched near the door and listened. It sounded like a young kid, completely hysterical, begging us to help her call her mom. My brother shouted threats, his voice booming, but I felt a tug of doubt. What if she was really in trouble? I hesitated, torn between fear and pity, my hand hovering over the phone. Trust is a gamble when danger feels so close. I told her I was calling 911 and that help was on the way. My fingers shook as I dialed the operator's calm voice, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. My brother, in full adrenaline mode, opened the door, still holding a shotgun, and started yelling at her to calm down. The girl's silhouette came into view, small and trembling, pressed against the doorstep. I didn't agree with his approach, but in all fairness, she had woken up about half the blocks with her screaming while she pressed up against our door. Her sobs softened, but her eyes, wild glassy, locked onto mine. Was she a victim or a threat? I couldn't tell. And that uncertainty gnawed at me. Some sights burn into your soul. After he opened the door, I got to see her. She was young, maybe a teenager. Her clothes, disheveled hair, tangled like she'd been running. Honestly, I was kind of hoping it was a homeless person from our area, or even someone looking to do some weird stuff to us. But it was a kid. Her knees buckled as she knelt, clutching the doorstep like it was her lifeline. And the look in her eyes, while she was kneeling at our doorstep, made my heart drop. I wanted to help, but something felt off her story. Her desperation didn't quite fit. I was thinking that she was around 14, but she said someone had crashed into her car down the street, and she left her phone in the wreck, so she couldn't call her mom. Truth bends under pressure. Things weren't really adding up as I asked her a few more questions. She spoke in fragments: car crash, lost phone, needing her mom. But her details shifted. Her eyes darting. She kept begging me to go down the street with her. But I told her, no way. We're waiting for the cops. I glanced at my brother, still gripping the shotgun, his jaw tight. About 10 minutes later, 3 tow trucks drove by, heading toward where we told 911. The crash happened. The girl's pleas grew frantic, her hands trembling as she reached for Mari. Was she lying? Scared both. I stood my ground, but her desperation was a weight I couldn't shake, pulling me into her chaos. Our neighborhood wasn't a place for the faint-hearted. Boarded-up houses lined the block, their windows like empty eyes watching the street. We'd moved here after our parents passed, clinging to the only home we could afford. My brother, a mechanic with a temper, had seen too many fights to trust anyone. I worked nights at a warehouse, my nerves frayed from long shifts and the constant hum of danger outside our door. So I felt safe enough to walk with her down the street. The girl shuffled beside me, her bare feet slapping the cracked pavement. On the way, she kept asking to hold my hand. I dodged her grasp, my stomach twisting. "And I'm just thinking you look like a teenager. You're barely dressed, and I'm a grown man walking through a neighborhood you just woke up. Not a good look." Her story unraveled further as we walked. She claimed the crash happened near the old gas station, but I knew that corner no wreck could hide there. And I awkwardly asked how old she was. She said 18, and grabbed my hand. Her grip was cold, her nails digging into my skin. I pulled away, muttering about keeping distance. Anyway, I felt very uncomfortable, but her emotions were definitely outweighing mine at that time. I scanned the street, half expecting an ambush. The tow trucks had vanished, their engines a faint rumble in the distance. I wondered if I'd made a mistake leaving the house. Then headlights cut through the dark, a police cruiser. And halfway there, the cop showed up. I flagged them down and explained the situation. The girl's demeanor shifted. She babbled her words, tripping over each other. Meanwhile, she kept telling the officers over and over that I have really bad ADD and anxiety while handing me her eyelashes. I stared at the false lashes in her trembling hand, baffled. A full set of false lashes. I really didn't want to touch them, but I took them just to help her feel a little safer, or whatever. The officers exchanged glances, their radios crackling, and one of the cops pulled her aside, and the others started casually asking me a few questions. They mentioned a report of a barefoot teenager running through yards earlier that night. He told me they got another call about 30 minutes earlier that a teenager had been running across someone's lawn barefoot, which when I looked over, realized that she had been barefoot the whole time. Her feet were scraped, dirt-caked, as if she'd been wandering for hours. I recounted her story, my doubts, and the lashes still clutched in my hand. The officer's questions grew sharper. Where was I? Earlier, had I seen her before? I felt like a suspect, my nerves fraying under their scrutiny. The girl's voice rose as she spoke to the other officer, her words slurring into a plea. Then I saw them cuff her. I froze, caught between relief and guilt. I think they suspected she was on something which I myself thought as well. Her eyes met mine, not angry, but hollow, like she was somewhere else. The officer questioning me softened, explaining they'd take her to the station, maybe a hospital. As we were wrapping up, the officer saw me still holding the eyelashes and goes, "What are you going to do with those?" "Bro, and I just told him I'll sleep on it." I forced a laugh, but my chest was tight. I just want to go back to bed. I trudged home the street now quiet, the neighbor's lights off. I headed home and started talking to one of the neighbors about it, and he assumed it was her parents' house or something. He shrugged, unwilling to dig deeper. So he didn't want to get involved in domestic drama. Makes sense. I nodded, but the encounter clung to me, and I just assumed that's why no one else got involved. Back inside, I locked the door, the shotgun still leaning against the wall. I couldn't really go back to sleep because I was shaken up and pretty annoyed about her, and I imagined it was a traumatic experience for her. I sat on the couch, the eyelashes on the coffee table like a bizarre relic. I wondered about her real story, her family. Was she running from something worse than a crash? The neighborhood had its share of broken homes, kids caught in the crossfire of addiction. Or worse, I'd seen it before, but never this close. I checked the local news later, hoping for answers, but found nothing about a crash or an arrest. The silence was louder than her screams. Days later, a neighbor mentioned seeing a girl matching her description hanging around the gas station, always alone, always at night. I drove by once, half expecting to see her, but the corner was empty. I kept the eyelashes in a drawer, unsure why. Some things you can't let go. I don't know if this was a justified reaction for her situation, or if she really was on drugs or mentally ill, but I would definitely be praying for her and her family. The night left a mark, a question without an answer, and I knew I'd hear her cries in my dreams for a long time. The unwanted shadow. The store's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow that never felt quite safe. I moved through the aisles, stacking cans and checking prices, but my eyes kept darting to the glass doors at the front. Someone was out there, just beyond the parking lot, a vague shape in the dusk. I told myself it was a customer, a passerby, but the feeling of being watched clung to me like damp air. Every shift that shadow lingered, never close enough to identify, never far enough to ignore. It wasn't just my imagination. The first time I noticed him, he was leaning against a street lamp, his face half hidden by a hoodie. He didn't move, didn't shop, just stood there, staring through the glass. My hands fumbled with a box of cereal as I realized he was looking at me. I turned away, heart thudding, and busied myself with work, but the weight of his gaze followed me down every aisle. He knew my name. That was the worst part. I'd been away for a while, and when I returned, a coworker pulled me aside, her voice low. A coworker told me that some guy had been coming around every day asking for me. She didn't know who he was, only that he was young, maybe my age, and seemed off, too intense, too focused. I laughed it off, but my stomach nodded a warning I couldn't shake. His presence grew bolder. I caught glimpses of him on the security monitors loitering near the entrance, his eyes scanning the store. A few hours passed by, and my coworker came and told me that the guy was back and again asking for me. I froze, staring at the grainy footage. He wasn't familiar. No one I'd met. No one I knew. But he knew me, and that knowledge felt like a violation, a crack in the safety of my routine. I couldn't avoid him forever. Curiosity, or maybe desperation, pushed me to confront him. I decided to go ask what he wanted, and he was clearly drunk and said that he had seen me on TV and wanted to ask me out. His words slurred his smile too wide, unnatural. I replied, "I'm sorry, but I'm in a relationship even though I was single." He swayed unfazed and asked if he could follow me inside to help. I backed away, my voice sharp, but his eyes never left me gleaming with something I couldn't name. The encounter left me rattled. I could see him through the cameras outside the store, drinking. He didn't leave, just lingered in the parking lot, a bottle in hand, watching the doors. I started taking the back exit, my heart racing as I scanned the shadows for his silhouette. The next day I came to work and saw him waiting for me outside the store. His grin was too eager, too knowing. He followed me inside and said that he needed to talk. I brushed him off, repeating that I had a boyfriend, but he trailed me through the aisles asking to help again. Every step he took echoed in my chest, a reminder that I wasn't alone, not in the way I wanted. I tried to outsmart him. I started asking my male coworker to escort me safely to the tram every night when my shift ended. My coworker, a burly guy with a kind smile, became my shield. Walking me to the stop, his presence a temporary relief. But the messages started soon after. I started getting messages like, "Is that your boyfriend? And he doesn't need to know if we go out." The texts came from an unknown number, each one a jolt of fear. How did he know my number? Who had betrayed me? I confronted my coworkers and a new hire. Admitted she'd given it out, thinking he was a friend. My anger burned, but it was nothing compared to the dread. I enlisted my brother next. I asked my brother if he could drive me to work on his motorcycle and hug me outside my workplace so it looked like he was my boyfriend. We staged the act. His arms around me in the parking lot, a performance for an unseen audience. But the messages didn't stop. He was watching, always watching, and no lie could shake him. The texts grew bolder, more invasive, hinting at details of my day. He shouldn't have known my lunch break, my favorite sweater. The store became a maze of fear. I avoided the front entrance, kept my head down, checked the cameras obsessively. I looked at the camera footage, and yet again, he was waiting for me outside. His persistence was relentless, a shadow I couldn't escape. I started eating lunch in the back room, the monitor glowing with his image always there, always waiting. Every glance at the screen was a reminder he wasn't giving up. Then came the nightmare. I came to work one day and was in the changing room and heard that we have a new coworker, and it was his first day. I stepped out, adjusting my apron, and froze. Another coworker said, "Hey, this is James." My blood ran cold. I said, "I know. This is the creep that had been stalking me for weeks." His smile was the same, too wide, too wrong. He was here inside my world, a predator in my sanctuary. I stormed to my boss, demanding answers. My boss said that he had no idea that this was my stalker, and kind of just laughed it off as no big deal. I was livid. I told him either he leaves or I will. He promised separate shifts, but it was a lie. I had a lot of shifts with him, and whenever I went, he would just follow me without saying a single word. His silence was worse than his words, a quiet menace that filled the air. I would often have my lunch break by the computer, so I could see where he was. The cameras showed him lingering, staring, his eyes locked on me as I ate. Work became a prison. I moved through my tasks like a ghost, every sound a potential threat. He would text me every day, but at work he didn't say a thing, just sit there and stare. The texts were relentless questions, invitations, hints that he knew my schedule. I blocked his number, but new ones appeared. Each message a reminder of his reach. I started to wonder if he'd ever stop, if I'd ever feel safe again. My coworkers noticed the change in me. I was jumpy, distracted, my laughter gone. Some tried to help, keeping an eye on him, but it wasn't enough. My boss finally understood what a freak James was, and that he really didn't do any work either. He started watching James closely, looking for a reason to act. One time, I noticed James was clearly drunk at work, and I finally told my boss. That was the breaking point. Thankfully, that day he got fired. The relief was immediate, but fragile. I kept checking the cameras, half expecting to see him in the parking lot, but he was gone, at least from the store. The texts stopped, the shadows retreated, and I tried to reclaim my life. Yet the fear lingered, a scar that wouldn't fade. What if he came back? What if he was still watching? I started carrying a small knife in my bag, checking my surroundings obsessively. I dug into how he'd found me. The news clip, a fleeting moment of exposure, had painted a target on my back. I stopped posting online, changed my number, kept my life small. The world felt less open, less safe, like danger could lurk in any stranger's smile. My coworkers became my allies, their support a lifeline. But I couldn't shake the sense that I'd been marked. The store itself felt tainted. Every aisle, every corner held a memory of his gaze. I started looking for new jobs, craving a fresh start. But the fear followed me, a shadow I couldn't outrun. I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, locking my doors twice, avoiding strangers who lingered too long. His presence had rewritten my sense of safety, and no amount of logic could undo it. Months later, I left the store for good. My new job was quieter. Farther away, a place where no one knew my name. But I still felt him sometimes, in the pause before I entered a room, in the flicker of a stranger's glance. I told myself he was gone, that I was free. But the truth was messier. Fear doesn't vanish, it burrows, waiting for a quiet moment to surface. Now I'm rebuilding step by step. I laugh more, trust a little, but I'm different. The girl who walked into that store carefree and open is gone. I check my locks, avoid crowded places, keep my story close. And sometimes when I'm alone, I wonder, what if he's still out there, waiting for another glimpse? The thought is irrational, but it's mine, a piece of the shadow he left behind. The man who wouldn't stop. The restaurant was a glittering oasis, its polished tables and soft jazz, a stark contrast to the chaos of a busy shift. He was seated in my section, so I went over to get his drink and food order. I was 15, navigating the world of a Michelin-starred dining room with a smile plastered on my face. The man, dressed in a crisp three-piece suit, clutched a carton of eggs. An odd detail that stuck with me. His eyes followed me too closely, a gaze that felt like a weight. I scribbled his order, eager to move on. But he wasn't done with me. His voice was smooth, probing. And once I got his order, he kept talking, asking about my education, what I was doing in school, and what my plans were for the future, what my hobbies were, my name, etc., etc. The questions piled up, each one a step too far. It was just a little too much to be polite, but I let it slide. I was swamped, exhaustion creeping in, and I didn't want a scene. I was busy, tired, and I didn't want any trouble. I brushed it off, thinking he'd leave, and that would be the end. I was wrong. He became a fixture, a shadow that returned too often. For the next couple of months, he would come in to 3 days every week. His confidence grew, his words laced with flirtation. He got more confident, attempting to flirt with me, ask me to come out with him after work, etc. I dodged his invitations, my smile tighter each time. Then, during one shift, he crossed a line. His hand grazed my back, sliding lower, a violation disguised as a casual touch. I was walking him to his table, and he slid his hands down my back and over my butt. My blood ran cold, but I turned, voice steady. I turned around and somehow politely told him not to touch me and not to push my boundaries, as I was only 15. And he knew that, and I didn't serve him that day. The incident lingered, a stain on my days. Now, a week later, he comes in, and I refuse to serve him again. I stayed away, letting my manager handle him. My manager took over his table, but he found a way. During a break when the floor was empty, he approached his presence, a sudden chill. His hands brushed my arms, a deliberate act. Yet when everybody was on break, and I was the only one on the floor, he came inside. And he knew by this point that it was table service only, and he came up behind me, bringing his hands down my arms. I pushed back, voice firm, despite the tremor. I was shaken up, but politely again told him not to touch me. He left, but his shadow didn't. He faded for a while, but the reprieve was temporary. The town felt different now, its charming streets tainted. I walked through the town center to get to work. It's about a 25-minute walk from the train station. One day, his car slowed beside me, his eyes locked on mine through the window. As I was walking to work one day, he saw me from his car and followed me into work. I hurried inside, heart pounding, and told my managers. And I immediately told my managers, who again told me to stay away from him. They kept him at a distance, but the restaurant's walls couldn't shield me outside. Another day sipping coffee, far from work, I saw him again. He followed me on foot, his steps a quiet echo. A week later, I was having coffee before work and about a 50-minute walk from my job. What do you know? Guess who sees me and follows me? On foot to work. I reported it, and my managers intervened. I told my managers again, who kept me away from him again. The encounters grew bolder. He began asking for me directly, his voice carrying a chilling certainty. Yet that day was different. He asked my managers for me, saying he knew I was there because he'd seen me. My managers stood firm, a barrier I was grateful for. But his persistence was a noose tightening around my life. The town, once a safe haven, was now a maze of potential traps. When I took time off, he still came searching. Supposedly, he came in a few times asking for me, and didn't come in much when I wasn't anywhere to be seen. His absence was no comfort. It only meant he was waiting. It's just truly terrifying that I have a stalker who shows up every Easter. The restaurant. My job, my walks through town, they were no longer mine. His presence was a constant reminder that safety was an illusion and he could shatter at will. The watcher in the garage. The parking garage loomed like a concrete beast, its empty ramps swallowing sound and light in the dead of night. Every step Ethan took echoed a lonely pulse in the vast hollow structure. But tonight the silence felt heavier, watchful. His flashlight beam danced across the walls, catching glints of graffiti and stains, yet it couldn't pierce the shadows that seemed to shift just out of sight. He was alone, or so he thought, until a faint scuff, not his own, whispered from the darkness above. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for him to notice. I work at a recently built city parking garage and transit hub, and late at night, it is my job to lock everything up until the morning and patrol the dark building alone with just a radio linked to the local police department. The routine was rote. Lock the gates, check the ramps, report anything odd. It's a very simple procedure that takes maybe 10 minutes to lock everything up, with 15-minute walkthroughs every hour. Ethan dragged his boots across the concrete, exhaustion weighing his limbs. I drag myself through the security center. Fancy talk for a room with a chair and monitors, and begin my ascent through the ramps. The air was thick with the city's decay. I could smell the typical putrid smell of the city, of the fermenting feces in the trash can from the numerous homeless from around the area using the trash bins. The odor clung to everything, a reminder of the hub's underbelly. We had to lock down the public bathrooms to prevent damage, theft, vandalism, and most importantly, deaths from people overdosing in there in the middle of the night. Ethan's radio crackled faintly, a lifeline to the outside world. I listen to my footsteps echo and realize it seems quieter than usual. Too quiet. The usual hum of distant traffic was gone, replaced by a stillness that pressed against his eardrums. He climbed to the top floor, the 7th, where the city skyline glittered through gaps in the concrete. I finally got to the top floor and some of the elevator. The air was cooler here, sharper. I placed my forehead against the door, feeling the cold air rush up through the elevator shaft as it reached my floor with a satisfying. The elevator dinged doors, sliding open with a groan. Ethan stepped inside, the fluorescent light flickering. I stepped to the ground floor and continued back to the office. His boots scuffed the floor, the sound swallowed by the vastness of the garage. Back at the security center, Ethan pushed through the stubborn door. I fling the door open and I head inside, running for the cold office room and using my magnet fob to unlock the door. The lock clicked, but the door caught. The door usually gets hung up a little, so with a swift heel I slam it shut, and I make my way to the desk. He sank into the chair, the room's chill a relief after the humid ramps. The computer that runs the cameras is worthy of being called ancient. I'm pretty sure that they don't even make them anymore. The monitor glowed faintly pixelated footage, stuttering across the screen. Not to mention the internet that the cameras run off of are so slow that it takes forever to update. Ethan leaned back, watching the delayed footage of himself trudging through the garage. And so I sat there with my new favorite pastime, watching myself walk around with a tremendous amount of lag time. The lag was comical, his figure jerking like a marionette. And I sat there, watching myself drudge on through the stupidly hot weather. He chuckled, seeing his own tired slump. And I laugh at myself as I watch my head land against the cold steel on top floor elevator doors. The footage showed him at the elevator, forehead pressed to the door. Then the world tilted. As the doors open and the light floods the area around me, my blood went ice cold. There is a man standing no more than 6 feet away, just staring at me. The figure was tall, gaunt, his face obscured by shadow eyes glinting like coins in the dim light. And as I entered the elevator, he headed for the stairs, already vaulting down the steps. Ethan's breath caught his hands fumbling for the radio. My heart races as I watch each camera as he hits each floor. I hit the fourth, the third, almost seamlessly. The man's movements were fluid, deliberate, matching the elevator's descent. He keeps perfect time with the elevator. Panic clawed at Ethan's chest. My ears begin to boil as I feel all the blood rush to my head. I'm having a hard time breathing. The cameras showed the man's shadow flickering across each floor closer with every frame. I watch as the elevator doors close, and he begins following me again, getting closer and closer after each turn of the corner. Ethan's pulse thundered, his eyes glued to the screen. I watch as I fling open the door, and he catches it heading in right behind me, my heart pounding in my eardrums. He's inside the building. The footage showed the door swinging, then stopping, caught by an unseen hand. He was inside. Ethan's hands shook, scrolling through the cameras. I keep watching, knowing that I should look away, but I can't find him. The office was silent, the door still. And then I see why. I kicked the door shut in his face, which means, as I searched the room, I eventually discovered that it's just me in there. Relief flooded him, then dread. Had he imagined it? I radio for a few officers to come in, and they sweep the building, giving me a slap on the wrist for not paying attention, and left. The officers found nothing. No footprints, no signs of entry. The rest of the night I stayed in that room. I watched each camera diligently, but never saw him again. But the night wasn't done with Ethan. The cameras flickered static, cutting through the feed. He froze, staring at the screen. For a split second, the footage showed the top floor again, empty, except for a shadow that wasn't there before. It moved not toward the stairs, but toward the camera, its edges blurring like smoke. Ethan blinked, and the feed cleared. Nothing. His radio stayed silent, but the air in the room felt charged, heavy with unseen eyes. The next night, he found something new. A scratch on the elevator door, deep and jagged, where his forehead had rested. It hadn't been there before. Was it a mark from the man, or something else? Ethan asked the day shift, but no one had seen anything. The cameras showed nothing unusual, yet the scratch gleamed under his flashlight, fresh and deliberate. Then came the whispers. Not from the radio, but from the ramps themselves. Faint, unintelligible, like voices trapped in the concrete. Ethan checked the cameras, but the footage lagged, looping over empty floors. One night, the monitor froze on the 7th floor, showing a figure standing where he'd seen the man. It didn't move, just stared, its face a void. Ethan rebooted the system, and the image vanished, but his skin prickled, the room too small, too exposed. A maintenance worker, old and grizzled, shared a story over coffee. The land under the garage had been a dumping ground decades ago, a place where things got buried, trash, secrets worse. He'd heard whispers too, seen shadows that didn't belong. Some things don't leave, he said, his eyes distant. Ethan laughed it off, but the words stuck, burrowing deep. Now Ethan's patrols are different. Now every time I go to work, I can ever shake the feeling that I'm being watched. He checks the cameras obsessively, but they're always empty. Or are they? Last week the elevator stopped between floors, the lights flickering, and for a moment he swore he saw breath fogging the metal door. He doesn't rest his head on the elevator anymore. The garage is never truly empty, and whatever watches him knows his name.